I was 68 when I found the envelope, though the paper inside it had been written when I was 32 and believed life waited politely for a man to get himself together. My wife had been gone 3 winters. The house had quieted down after the second person was no longer moving through it. And I had started opening boxes from a closet because my daughter said it was time to stop living around stacks of old intentions. The envelope was tucked inside a folder marked taxes, because that was the kind of man I had always been. I hid the most personal things in the most practical places, and then acted surprised when my life started to feel filed away instead of lived. It was a job offer from Denver, folded, with my younger signature half written on the bottom and never finished. They had wanted me to start in June and take the chance I spent 10 years saying I never got. I stood there in the hallway with my glasses low on my nose and felt something colder than nostalgia move through me. People talk about regret as if it arrives like thunder. One dramatic strike, one ruined choice, one unforgettable mistake. That is not how it came to me. It came like arithmetic, quiet, merciless. One safe decision added to another, one delay leaning against the next, until the total became a life I could explain to everybody else, but never quite defend to myself. Back then, I had told my wife the same thing I told myself. The timing was bad. The children were young. The mortgage was fresh. The move was risky. And there would be other chances once we were more secure. I said it in the calm voice of a responsible man. I did not say the truer thing, which was that I was terrified to discover whether I had any real courage once comfort was no longer available as an excuse. That is the truth nobody likes to hear about regret. Most of it does not come from disaster. It comes from obedience to your own fear while pretending you are serving something noble. I called it protecting my family. I called it being steady. I called it maturity. Ellen did not argue hard enough to make a scene, but I still remember the way she stood at the kitchen sink that night, drying her hands on a towel with faded strawberries on it, asking if I was sure I wanted to say no. I told her yes, absolutely, and even in that moment I heard the deadness in my own certainty. A man can feel himself shrinking and still keep talking. After I found that letter, I sat at the table where Ellen used to pay bills and make Christmas lists, and I could see the beginning of everything more clearly than I ever saw it while I was living it. Regret had not started with old age. It had started the first time I confused relief with wisdom and let that feeling become a habit. Once I saw that, the letter was no longer just a letter. It was evidence. And evidence, when you are old enough, has a way of forcing the rest of the story to come forward. When that Denver offer came, I was working at a regional supply company in a beige building with no windows in the back offices and a clock above the break room microwave that always ran 4 minutes slow. I can still smell the burnt coffee and carbon paper when I think about that place. I had been there 7 years, long enough to know where every folder lived and who got nervous before budget meetings and how to keep my head down when upper management wanted someone to blame. The promotion out west was the first thing that had ever landed in my lap that felt like a doorway instead of another hallway. My supervisor shut the office door and congratulated me in a voice I had never heard him use with me before. He said, "This is the kind of move men wait their whole careers for." I nodded like a man receiving good news, but inside I was already looking for reasons to stay where I was. Ellen was excited in the pure, dangerous way hopeful people can be. She spread maps on the kitchen table after the kids were asleep. She circled neighborhoods. She talked about mountains as if fresh air itself might change the rhythm of our lives. Our son was 4, our daughter not yet 2, and money was always close enough to worry about. We had one car that made a bad belt noise in the mornings and a mortgage that scared me more than I admitted. Everything practical in our lives leaned towards staying put. That was the argument I let do my talking for me. Looking back, I understand practical problems are powerful because they are real. Fear loves real details. It hides behind grocery bills and moving costs and school districts because those things can be spoken aloud without shame. For 2 weeks I lived in performance. At work I acted thoughtful. At home I acted burdened. Alone I was not burdened. I was frightened. Not of failing in some heroic public way. I was frightened of succeeding and then being required to become a larger man than the one I had learned to be. A chance does not only offer you more. Sometimes it demands that the smaller version of you die first, and I was not ready for that kind of funeral. So I made lists. I compared insurance. I asked cautious questions. I slowed the whole thing down until momentum curdled into doubt. Ellen watched me do it. She knew the truth before I did. I was not studying the risk. I was feeding it. The night I turned it down, the children were asleep, the dishwasher was humming, and the kitchen light made everything look a little more tired than it had during the day. I called Denver from the wall phone and thanked them for the opportunity in my most professional voice. Then I hung up and felt immediate relief, which I mistook for confirmation. Relief is not always peace. Sometimes it is just fear getting its way. By morning, I was already explaining the decision as if it had been wise for years. A story told often enough can quiet your conscience for a while. It cannot keep your life from answering back. Life did not punish me right away for staying. That is part of why regret takes so long to recognize. If every fearful choice brought immediate ruin, even stubborn men would learn faster. Instead, what followed looked respectable from the outside. I kept my job. We paid the mortgage. The kids grew. My supervisor retired, and I inherited some of his responsibilities without inheriting his title, which was the kind of half-reward I had a talent for accepting. Ellen went back to part-time work at the library once both children were in school, and we settled into a routine so functional that people admired it. We were the dependable family. The lawn got cut. The gifts were bought on time. We showed up to birthday parties with covered dishes and left before things got messy. Nothing in our life looked broken enough to alarm anyone. That was the camouflage. But a life can be stable and still slowly drain the color from itself. I began waking before the alarm with my jaw already tight. I drove the same route to work past the same shuttered diner and same church sign and same cracked billboard. And I remember one morning realizing I had gone 2 full exits without thinking a single thought that belonged to me. I was not in crisis. I was absent. That frightened me more than hardship would have, because hardship at least gives a man something clear to name. Dullness is harder to confess. How do you tell your wife that you are not miserable enough to leave and not alive enough to stay grateful? So I did what many men do when they are disappointed in themselves. I became efficient. I fixed things around the house. I balanced the checkbook down to the penny. I offered structure where what was missing was spirit. Ellen tried, gently at first, to invite me back into my own life. She would suggest weekend drives, concerts in the park, dinners with people who laughed louder than we did. Sometimes she spoke directly. She told me I always seemed to be bracing for something. She asked why I could never enjoy a good season without preparing for the bad one behind it. I gave her the same answer in different clothes every time. Someone had to be responsible. That sentence did a lot of damage in our marriage. Responsibility is a fine thing until it becomes a mask for emotional retreat. I wore it so often, I forgot there was a face under it. The first serious crack came over something small, like many important cracks do. Ellen wanted us to take the kids to Colorado one summer because she still talked about those mountains as if we had left a sentence unfinished there. I said we could not justify the expense. She looked at me across the dinner table for a long moment and said very quietly, "You always know why not." I still hear that line, not because it was dramatic, but because it was exact. I always knew why not. I had built a whole identity around it. And once a man begins to understand that he is the reason his own life feels narrow, every ordinary day starts sounding different. By my early 40s, the consequences of that first refusal had spread into parts of my life I'd once believed were separate. That is another unpleasant truth about regret. It never stays in the room where it began. I thought I had turned down a job. What I had really turned down was a version of myself that might have been more open, more generous, less governed by dread. Without realizing it, I kept choosing in loyalty to the man who had said no. At work, I stopped putting my name forward for opportunities. When a younger manager suggested I apply for a national role that involved travel and more visibility, I laughed it off and said I was too old for the circus, though I was 43. At home, I became skilled at discouraging possibility before it could stir anything in me. If the children dreamed too loudly, I answered with practical questions until their excitement lowered itself to a manageable volume. I did not think of myself as a fearful father. I thought of myself as a grounding one. That distinction protected my pride for years. When my son talked about art school, I steered him toward business classes. When my daughter wanted to spend a semester overseas in college, I asked if that was really necessary when there were good programs closer to home. I did not scream. I did not forbid. I simply leaned on uncertainty with all the authority of a man who looked reasonable. I see now how powerful that kind of fear can be inside a family. It does not need to dominate the room. It only needs to keep asking cautious questions until hope starts apologizing for itself. Ellen and I began having conversations that circled the same ache without landing on it. She would say we had become too careful. I would say that was what adulthood looked like. She would ask when we were supposed to enjoy what we had worked for. I would tell her enjoyment was easier when bills were paid and futures were protected. We were not really arguing about money or schedules or vacations. We were arguing about whether life was something to inhabit or manage. She still believed in inhabiting it. I had become a manager of conditions, a man preparing to be worthy of a life I was refusing to enter. There is no medal for that kind of self-denial. There is only distance, and distance is quiet when it begins. The worst part was that I still thought time would solve what courage had not. I assumed there would come a calmer season, a less expensive year, a safer opening, and then I would soften. Then I would travel. Then I would speak more freely. Then I would stop living as though one wrong turn would end everything. But time does not correct avoidance. It teaches it routes. It makes a familiar road feel legitimate, just because your tires have worn tracks into it. By the time I understood that, the children were gone more than they were home. Ellen had learned not to ask certain questions. And our marriage was entering the kind of silence that sounds polite to outsiders and lonely to the people sitting inside it. The moment I should have paid attention came on our 25th anniversary, though I did not understand it then. Ellen had booked a weekend at a lake inn 2 hours away, not fancy, just cedar walls, a little dock, a restaurant with too much burgundy carpet and decent pie. She planned it herself because she was tired of waiting for me to initiate joy. I remember arriving after dark and standing on the balcony outside her room while wind pushed across the water. She stepped beside me and said, with a tenderness that makes the memory harder, "We used to imagine things so easily." I answered with some flat remark about how life had been busier than we expected. She did not argue. She just nodded in the way people do when they are setting down a hope they have carried too long. The next morning, she wanted to rent a small boat. I worried about the weather. She wanted to drive the long road around the lake and stop at roadside antique places. I wanted to get ahead of traffic coming home. She wanted dessert after dinner, even though we had both had enough. I said we did not need to overdo it. Looking back, I wince at how often I use the language of moderation to justify withholding. I thought love was proven through provision, steadiness, showing up, fixing what broke, paying what was owed. Those things matter. They are not small. But there is a hunger in marriage those things do not touch. A person can be well cared for and still feel deeply unlived with. Ellen was lonely with me long before she was ever alone without me. A year later, she told me she had started walking in the mornings without asking if I wanted to come, because my answer was always some version of later. That word had become the signature of my character. Later for travel, later for rest, later for risk, later for difficult conversations, later for tenderness that required spontaneity instead of duty. What nobody tells you when you are younger is that later is a room many relationships never come back from. It sounds harmless because it is not a direct refusal. That is what makes it dangerous. It leaves the door technically open while the heart behind it keeps closing. I thought I was preserving options. Ellen was experiencing abandonment in installments. When she finally said she was tired, really tired, of living with the emotional weather of a man who never arrived in the present, I defended myself the way I always had. I listed everything I had done for our family, every payment made, every repair finished, every sacrifice quietly absorbed. She listened and then asked one question that emptied the room. Did you ever notice none of that was the thing I was asking for? I did not have an answer. Men like me can survive on competence for a very long time. What we cannot survive is the moment competence is revealed as unrelated to intimacy. That night, for the first time, I began to suspect regret was not waiting for me in old age. It was already living at my table, and it had my own voice. Ellen did not leave me in some dramatic fashion. There was no suitcase by the door, no shattered plate, no last speech in the rain. Real endings in long marriages are often plainer than that. She simply withdrew the last of her belief that I would become more available if she stayed patient enough. We remained in the same house. We ate many meals at the same table. We attended our daughter's wedding and smiled in photographs and held grandchildren and looked, I am sure, like a couple who had weathered life well. In some ways, we had. But weathering is not the same as sharing. By then, she had built a world of interior independence that no longer required much from me. I had not noticed her building it because I mistook the absence of fighting for peace. Silence does not always mean harmony. Sometimes it means the important part is over. She got sick in her early 60s, not all at once, but in the layered way illness enters a life and starts reorganizing it. More appointments, more fatigue, different prescriptions lined up by the coffee maker. For a while, I responded the only way I knew how, with tasks. I drove. I tracked medications. I learned insurance language. I installed handrails. I became indispensable in the practical sense, and part of me took comfort in that because logistics were still a language I could speak fluently. But illness sharpens truth. There were afternoons when she sat in her chair by the window, blanket over her knees, and looked at me with a softness that felt almost maternal. Once she said, "You always wanted so badly not to make mistakes." I said that seemed like a strange thing to criticize. She smiled, the saddest smile I ever saw, and answered, "That wasn't the mistake." I have replayed that exchange more times than I can count. At the time, I heard it as a riddle. Now I hear it as mercy. She was telling me I had measured life by the wrong danger. I had spent decades trying to avoid the embarrassment of a wrong move, the cost of a failed risk, the instability of desire acted on too boldly. Meanwhile, the larger loss had gone mostly unchallenged. The erosion that comes from never stepping fully into love, work, joy, conflict, wonder, grief, or change. I thought regret belonged to people who blew up their lives. Ellen knew better. Regret also belongs to people who keep sanding themselves down until nothing sharp enough remains to cut a new path. Near the end, she asked me to read to her sometimes. Not grand literature, whatever was lying around. One afternoon, I found myself reading aloud from a travel magazine article about train routes through the Rockies. She closed her eyes and listened. I stopped halfway because my throat tightened, and she knew why. She reached for my hand and squeezed it with what little strength she had left. "It wasn't Denver," she whispered. "It was always you being afraid to live there." That sentence did not accuse me. It uncovered me. And when a truth finally arrives without cruelty, there is nowhere left to hide. After Ellen died, people praised me in ways that should have comforted me, but somehow made the ache more precise. They said I had been devoted. They said I had taken wonderful care of her. They said she had been lucky to have me. I nodded, thanked them, accepted casseroles, folded sympathy cards, and kept feeling that there was a ledger nobody else could see. Public grief and private reckoning are not the same event. In public, I was the widower who had done his duty. In private, I was a man walking room to room through evidence of a life he had occupied responsibly and incompletely. Her scarf still hung by the door for months because I could not bear to move it. Her reading glasses stayed on the side table, beside the chair by the window. Every ordinary object seemed to ask the same question in a different shape. Why did you wait so long to become tender enough for this to matter the right way? I started waking in the night with memories that were not dramatic enough to explain to anybody else. Ellen turning in the passenger seat to point at a distant ridgeline we never visited. My son pausing in the garage as a teenager, sketchbook under his arm, waiting one extra second to see if I might say something encouraging instead of practical. My daughter calling from college, excited about a study program, and me asking about cost before asking what she hoped to see. That is how regret works when it is mature. It no longer needs the headline moments. It can ruin you with details, a shrug, a postponement, a sentence that lowered the temperature in the room. The mind, when given enough years, becomes an archive of doors it helped close. For a while, I tried to defend myself even then. I told myself I had done what many men of my generation were taught to do: provide, endure, stay. Do not gamble the family's stability on personal longing. There is truth in that. But age has stripped me of the appetite for half-honesty. Being shaped by something is not the same as being absolved by it. At some point, a man becomes responsible for the fear he keeps honoring. I honored mine for decades. I let it choose my work, moderate my marriage, and place its hand lightly on my children's shoulders whenever they leaned toward possibility. The plainest way to say it is the hardest one. I hurt people without ever looking reckless. That is why regret took me so long to recognize. It was dressed as decency. The afternoon I opened that envelope from Denver, all of these smaller memories began lining up behind it like witnesses. I thought I was grieving one abandoned path. I was really meeting the pattern that had governed most of my life. Once I saw that, the question changed. It was no longer, what did I miss? It was, what did my fear cost the people who loved me while I was busy calling it responsibility? That is not a sentimental question. It is a severe one. And severe questions, if you let them, can still do honest work in a man who has less road ahead than behind. I cannot tell this story honestly and end it by pretending regret is useful just because it is painful. Pain alone teaches very little. Some people grow old repeating the same explanations until the coffin closes. I could have done that easily. I had the language for it and a whole lifetime of sounding reasonable. What changed me, if I can claim I changed at all, was not the discovery that I had regrets. It was the discovery that regret was not mainly about the chances I lost. It was about the person I became while losing them. That is the truth no one likes to hear. The deepest regret is rarely, I failed. More often it is, I kept becoming someone smaller in order to avoid failing. In the years since Ellen died, I have tried to answer that truth with whatever honesty remains available to me. I called my son and told him I was sorry for every time I treated caution as wisdom when he needed courage from his father. He was quiet for a while, then kinder than I deserved. I told my daughter I knew I had a habit of meeting joy with concern. She laughed softly and said she had known that for years, but she was glad I finally did too. I took the train trip through the Rockies alone at 70, not because it repaired anything, but because I wanted once in my life to go somewhere beautiful without first interrogating whether beauty had earned its place in the budget. I sat by the window and cried at mountains I might have seen younger, with a woman who would have loved them more than I did. There was no redemption in that, only clarity. Clarity, though, has its own dignity. I no longer say I had no choice. I had choices. I feared many of them. I no longer say I stayed safe for the sake of everyone else. Sometimes I stayed safe because fear had become my preferred form of control. I no longer call every restraint mature. Some restraint is wisdom. Some is cowardice in a pressed shirt. It has taken me a long time to learn the difference. That is the final cruelty of regret. By the time you see it clearly, much of what it cost cannot be restored. Ellen is not here. My children grew up under the weather system I created. The younger man in that hallway with the unfinished signature is unreachable now. There will be no revised draft for him. Still, I think there is one mercy left in telling the truth plainly. A life can be misread while it is being lived, but it does not have to be misnamed forever. Mine was not ruined by one catastrophe. It was narrowed by repeated obedience to fear. It looked respectable. It often felt sensible. It even earned praise. But the praise was never the point. The point is that I stood in my own doorway again and again and called it shelter. That is what I finally understand when I look back. Regret is not only the pain of what never happened, it is the late recognition that you were present for the turning away, and did it with your own hand